Everyone, and thanks so much for joining us, and welcome to the final event in our 2020 International Animal Law Speaker Series. This series is co-organized by two International Animal Law ABA groups, one chaired by me, the other chaired by Dana Bray and Joan Schaffner. Special thanks to both of them for helping coordinate and advertise this event. With that said, I'm excited to introduce our moderator for this panel, Kayla Venckauskas, the inaugural Rena Roseman Legal Fellow at Mercy for Animals, who will be introducing our panelists.
Thank you, Raj, and thank you to the committees co-hosting this International Animal Law Speaker Series. And thank you everyone for joining. It is my honor to introduce you to our panelists, who I have also had the pleasure of working with during my fellowship. Fabiola Balmori graduated in law from the Universidad Iberoamericana, specialist in Amparo and Human Rights from the National Institute of Criminal Science, Master in Criminal Law from the Universidad NUAC, doctoral candidate in business law from the Universidad NUAC, and certified by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners as a fraud examiner. She served as a criminal litigation attorney for 10 years and served as the general counsel in companies in the construction industry, credit unions, and the aesthetic beauty industry. For almost 3 years, she has collaborated for the international organization Mercy for Animals as a staff attorney for Latin America at the Department of Legal Affairs. She has also taught courses on fraud in the insurance market and legal argumentation, such as workshops on the history of feminism in Mexico, the impact of a plant-based diet, and animal rights. Paula Cardoso got her law degree in 2010 at the Catholic University of Sao Paulo and is postgraduated in business contracts at the Getúlio Vargas Foundation. After working as a corporate attorney in different law firms, she started her own practice and joined Mercy for Animals in 2017. She's currently responsible for the legal affairs department at Mercy for Animals in Brazil. And Sonia Shad is an animal welfare lawyer. She graduated from the National Law School of India University in 2018. She is currently the manager of the Animal Law Center at the National Academy of Legal Studies and Research. She has worked with Mercy for Animals, the Humane Society International India, and other animal welfare organizations, both in India and the United States. She is the founder of the Society for Non-Human Persons, the first student-run animal protection group at a law school in India. Sonia is dedicated to the eradication of systematic forms of cruelty and has been working for animal welfare and rights since 2014. Thank you to our wonderful panelists for being here today. The format of this panel will be in a question and answer style, where I will ask the panelists a question and they will each get a turn to answer. We will hold audience questions until the end, but feel free to submit questions through our Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom chat here. So let's jump right in with our first question. Many here may be familiar with ag-gag laws, but for those who are not, in broad terms, ag-gag laws are laws that are enacted to gag would-be whistleblowers and undercover investigators by punishing them for recording footage of what goes on in animal agriculture facilities. So the first question for our panelists: does your country have any ag-gag type laws related to farmed animals? And if not, are there any pushes to enact them? So first, our first panelist, Fabi.
Thank you, Kayla. Thank you for the opportunity. Well, before I answer the question, I want to give a little bit of background. Mexico is starting with the conversation of animal rights. We are currently just talking about companion animals, so it's kind of far-fetched to think about ag-gag laws. But analyzing the laws in Mexico, we can see that there's no answer. There's a lot of nuance in between, and de facto we have. And the reason that we have it is due to high index of criminal activity from organized crime. So we can see states where it's criminalized the use of undercover cameras, or even to possess them in your car. Or in some states, actually, it's criminalized the freedom of speech. And by that, I mean that if you launch a possible undercover investigation where the reputation of this company could suffer, that would be a crime. So it's really I feel that they don't have the need to push for those gag laws because we have those kind of restrictions.
Thank you, Fabi. So our next panelist, Paula.
Thank you so much, Kayla. And I would like to thank all of you for the opportunity. And I'm so happy to be here alongside women that I admire so much. So this is really humbling for me, a very humbling experience. And when you introduced me, Kayla, I think it was important for me to tell the audience that I come from the corporate world. My background is from corporate law. So being able to speak here as an animal lawyer expert is something completely new to me, even though I've been doing this for so long. And I want to share this experience with you because the experience that I gathered as a corporate attorney actually helps me understand how companies face and deal with farmed animals. So the landscape in Brazil is actually very similar to the landscape in Mexico. And this is very expected. We're both Latin countries and we're sister and brother countries in many ways. So the vegan movement is in early stages compared to the United States. Maybe I wouldn't say we are that much focused in companion animals only, because the discussion around wild animals is also very important, and it is also very important in our region due to obviously due to the size of our forests and the importance of the Brazilian forest. But I think it's also important to provide some background on how the law works in Brazil. So criminal law is federal. It is very different from the United States in that sense. So we couldn't have this fight between states that have and the states that don't have ag laws or any other type of criminal law, because criminal law is federal. We also have strict laws regarding trespassing and other aspects of undercover investigations that would be addressed anyways by our regular criminal legislation. So we do not have ag laws as they are typically enacted in the United States, but we do have our regular criminal legislation that would address undercover investigation activities or aspects. It's also important to understand that Brazil is the third country that kills the most environmentalists in the world. We are behind our sister country, Colombia, and the Philippines only, according to the report issued by Global Witness. And so this, I think this information per se is already a way to decrease the amount of interest that organizations have in undercover investigations, let's put it that way. And we also have a problem with freedom of expression in Brazil as well. And I think that's also very similar to Mexico. So we don't have the concept that you have in the United States as like in the First Amendment. Freedom of expression is a completely different thing. So you can say whatever you want as long as, and this list goes on forever. So as Fabi said, if the image and the honor of a company or a business person is related to your campaign or your undercover investigation, then a crime might be considered not only defamation, but any crimes, as we say, crimes against the honor. That's how our criminal legislation frame it. And I think it's also important to say that the current Brazilian government talks a lot about controlling the activities of NGOs, and especially in the Amazon region. There are no actual laws in that sense, but the government talks a lot about it. So it creates an atmosphere of fear, and it can become, the Congress is very likely to enact laws that aim to regulate the activities of NGOs. We don't really know what this would look like, if they would be regulating funds or funding or the activities themselves, but it's out there. And I think the last thing I want to share with you is that even though we don't have a specific ag laws, the discussions tend to be taken to court here. So we've been noticing litigation increase towards animal protection organizations, and especially those that work with public awareness, because the impact on the company's image is higher. So we've been noticing how courts are dealing with this issue and how freedom of expression is being raised. And it is a very fragile constitutional right here.
Thank you, Paula. Sonia.
Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be able to share information about the country that I stay in and the farmed animal movement in my country and the laws surrounding it. And I hope everyone can learn something about the place that I come from. So my country does not have any specific kinds of ag laws in the way that the United States does. The context that I would like to provide is our constitution is our country is quasi-federal. So certain things are on the central list, certain things are on the state list, and certain things are on the concurrent list. Each of these lists allow different levels of governance to make laws on this. Animal cruelty is on the central list. So the central government makes laws that deal with protection of animals and prevention of animal cruelty. But agricultural law is on the state list. So as we go through this session, I will be able to highlight how this impacts the animal welfare movement and how this changes laws and how they apply to specific species of animals based on the cultural significance of that particular region and state. Each state in India is extremely diverse, and the cultures, religions, and people differ vastly. India is not a country that is predominantly vegetarian, as many people do presume. India is a country with a lot of non-vegetarians. Our per capita meat consumption is lower than most countries, but we are one of the countries with some of the highest export rates of milk, beef, chicken meat, fish, and pretty much every farmed animal on the list, unfortunately. So coming to the restrictions around undercover investigations and publication of them. Article 19(1)(a) of the Indian Constitution deals with the freedom of speech and expression, and this applies to the publication of undercover investigations. Because this is an article that grants citizens this right, it's not just organizations that can publish and carry out undercover investigations, it's also individual citizens. The Supreme Court of India themselves have endorsed the fact that undercover investigations can serve a larger public good, and it is possible for citizens to carry out undercover investigations. That being said, though, the courts aren't really for citizens carrying out these undercover investigations, because the restrictions on this are very difficult to navigate if citizens are encouraged to carry out these activities. The laws, as Paula mentioned, in Brazil, and as Fabi mentioned, similarly, there are criminal laws that would apply to situations that deal with undercover investigations, like criminal defamation, trespass, mischief, misrepresentation, things like that, that are all linked into criminal law. But that doesn't really affect the material collected. It just means we're liable for those acts. So the material itself can then later be submitted into court. There are two major guidelines that govern how undercover investigations happen in India. They are the Press Council of India guidelines and the News Broadcasting Standards Authority guidelines. Because it's legal in India, these are extensively regulated areas. They have very strict regulations on how the material is collected, when an undercover investigation is acceptable, how the undercover investigation has to be carried out, where the material has to be stored, how it has to be published, when it can be published, and if you're mandatory required to report the offense that you recorded. Because farmed animals in India are often kept in very badly maintained intensive confinement units in complete violation of the safety protections that do exist and in violation of the environmental laws, the food safety and standard laws. All of this stuff means that occasionally, and by occasionally I mean more often than not, it becomes mandatory to report it, and failure to do so is a crime in and of itself. The Contempt of Court Act in India says that in the event there is a pending case in the court relating to this particular issue, publication becomes illegal because they would like to maintain the concept of a fair trial. Because food adulteration is on the list of mandatory reporting according to our criminal procedure code, most undercover investigations with farmed animals actually have to be reported to the police. But on the bright side, when they are reported to the police and when they do go to court, we've been able to, through the movement and through all of the amazing organizations working in India, substantially change the way the law works. For instance, we have ended the slaughter of camels in Punjab and Haryana. The idea of intensive confinement units being set up, new intensive confinement units being set up in India have also been stopped currently for chickens and broilers, broiler hens and for egg-laying hens. These are all instances where the court steps in and utilizes this information that individual citizens provide them with. There's also there's also one more restriction on the publication, which is it can't cause mass panic. There is a case of a publication of an undercover investigation that was highlighted on a very popular news channel or TV channel in India called Zee TV, and it described the adulteration of milk. Unfortunately, it caused massive panic across India and milk sales drastically dropped. And even though the recorded material was true, the court unfortunately held that the goal was to sensationalize it and curb the sale of milk and cause mass public panic. So it's a very delicate balance of what you're allowed to publish and what you're not, but a very effective way, in my opinion at least, to use undercover investigations is to report it and get that case handled by the court and the police. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. So our second question is, are there any laws or regulations pertaining to slaughterhouses, treatment of the animals, inspections, slaughter, or anything along those lines in your country? So our first panelist, Fabi.
Yes, it is a federal regulation. It's a kind of a specific regulation called Official Mexican Standard. This is a regulation that comes from the Ministry of Agriculture, or in some cases with the Ministry of Health. It is aimed for animals for human consumption and wild animals. In that regulation, it established that the animals should be stoned before slaughter, and it's really a really technical regulation. Unfortunately, this kind of regulations should be updated every 5 years if they decided so, and it hasn't been updated since 2014. This means that they cannot keep up with the technology that is used in the industry. For example, in live shackle slaughter, Like we don't have the conversation regarding speed lines. Another huge issue that we have been facing is regarding the inspections. Like the regulation includes some inspections and to be certified that you comply with the law. In reality, we see that less than 1% of the slaughterhouses are inspected every year. Another relevant topic is that between 50 and 60% of the slaughterhouses in Mexico are owned by the municipalities. This means that all the resources comes from the state, and you pay a fee for the animal to be slaughtered. So what we have seen in these cases is the lack of resources, and that they don't offer any kind of training for the workers. And this means suffering for the animals. And the question is, well, can we report that kind of cruelty, or is it criminalized? Unfortunately, the answer is no. So, and also to take into consideration, almost 50% of the animals slaughtered in Mexico are slaughtered in municipally owned slaughterhouses. So we can imagine the kind of the conditions and the kind of cruelty that they suffer the animal before being slaughtered. Thank you.
Thank you. Paula?
Thank you. I remember when I was in my hiring process to join MFA, the images, the undercover investigation images that I received were from a pig slaughterhouse in Mexico. And it was good for me to have an idea of what I was getting into, but the conditions here are not that different, even though there are laws regulating inspection of slaughterhouses, the treatment of animals, and animal welfare standards. So the laws exist, but what happens? They are not followed, and how they are not being followed. So I think it's important to understand that not all slaughterhouses are subject to federal inspection. There are some state and local authorities that can also perform inspections. And I think one of the most important discussions that we have nowadays related to slaughterhouse inspection is that there are some state laws aiming to delegate the inspection activity to the private sector. And this means that the quality of the inspections that is already not good can become even worse. The society control of these activities can be more problematic, because when you're dealing with the private sector, you have a different kind of legislation that protects private companies. And right now in São Paulo state, São Paulo is the economic capital of Brazil. And so most consumers are based in São Paulo. There is a pending bill that was presented in late September. So this is a very recent bill that aims to delegate the inspection activity to the private sector in our state. I'm based in São Paulo. And it is also important to highlight the difference between inspections and supervision in Brazil. Inspections are related to the production process as a whole, and before, during, and after the slaughter of animals. This activity is held by agricultural authorities, agricultural government bodies. The supervision, on the other hand, is related to the hygienic and sanitary aspects of animal products. I think that's pretty similar to Mexico as well. So these activities, the supervision activities, are usually conducted by public health government bodies. So even though the focus of these two activities are different, what we've seen is that slaughterhouse with low hygienic and sanitary standards usually have low animal welfare standards as well. So the problem here is that the industry standard is low, so both related to animal welfare and sanitary issues. But I would say there is more concern about sanitary issues than animal welfare issues. And the standards of the law itself are low. So law is very broad. When the law tries to be precise, it leaves out many activities. So some laws are very specific to pigs and cows and leave out other species. So we do have a problem of having enough regulation of these activities. And when we do have regulation of these activities, they are very poorly handled and definitely not done in a very competent way. And now we have this other problem of delegating this to the private sector, which in our history tells us that the quality of the work is going to be even lower.
Thank you. Sonia.
So I'm about to explain the slaughter laws in my country, and they sound really good and they're extremely detailed. But I'd just like to point out implementation versus existence are very, very different in my country. So even though they sound good, the situation is not that good right now in India. So there are only a few animals that are allowed to be slaughtered in India. They are sheep, goats, pigs, poultry, fish, and cattle. Rabbits were recently introduced on this list. This is important because there are two other species of animals that are sometimes slaughtered in India. One of them is camels, and the other one is dogs. The good part is that there are a lot of on-ground animal rights organizations and welfare organizations that are very effectively tackling this illegal slaughter of camels and dogs in the country. And the numbers are significantly reducing over time. But the rest of the laws that apply to slaughter do not come through in the same way. So there is one specific law that deals with slaughterhouses and prevention of cruelty to animals in slaughterhouses, which is the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act Slaughterhouse Rules of 2001. And this is a very specific legislation, but because it's under the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, which we'll get into a little bit later, the punishments under this act are not very effective. They also, luckily and fortunately, come under the Food Safety and Standards Licensing and Registration of Food Business Regulations of 2011. And this is a very, very small part of a much, much larger regulation that determines a lot more than slaughterhouses, meat shops, and dairies. But one of the sections under slaughter of animals in this regulation is the animal welfare aspect of it. This law and the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Slaughterhouse Rules, they detail a lot of protections for these animals. From a welfare perspective, they require all animals to be stunned, including chickens. They list three different kinds of slaughter and they recommend three different kinds of stunning and the recommended method for each species. They list out how the animals have to be maintained. They list out how the animals have to be transported for the purpose specifically of slaughter. They say that no animal can be slaughtered in front of another. No unnecessary cruel means can be used to move the animals, to get them to do what is needed in the slaughterhouse. The animals have to be fit, they have to be healthy, they have to be able to walk, they have to be free from injuries. And that's just the welfare aspect. In addition to that, there are a lot of health and safety standards that have been attached to my knowledge, these safety standards are very, very rarely followed, and they're only followed in the biggest manufacturing chains of meat in India. But most slaughterhouses, and I think that's over 50, 60, maybe even 80% of the animals slaughtered, will not be slaughtered in a slaughterhouse that complies with these rules. They would have to test the animal by a veterinary officer before the animal is slaughtered and get a fit for slaughter certificate. They'd have to test the entire carcass, every part, including the organs, for safety, and give them a certificate that says this particular animal's meat is safe for human consumption. And only then is it technically supposed to be sent to a meat shop. No slaughter can happen in the same location as sale of meat, which is exceptionally common in India. In fact, live chicken shops are one of the most common sights you'll see in most metropolitan cities in India, and even mid-sized cities are pretty much everywhere in India. You will find live chicken shops. Live chicken shops are small, very tiny shops, probably the size of most of your room, like a single room in your home, a very small room in your home. And they house anywhere between 10 to 40 birds. They're kept in extremely cramped conditions in complete violation of all the laws. They're often deprived of water for days, food for days, and people will come to the store, ask for a chicken, they'll take one out of the cage in full view of all of the other chickens and slaughter that chicken in front of you and the animal. And they're often located next to vegetable stores, in common residential areas, and these cause health concerns, environmental concerns, and of course, animal welfare concerns. And yet, despite this being illegal, it is exceptionally prevalent. There is also one small thing that I will add in. When I discussed how there were state laws versus central laws, because animal husbandry is on the state list, we have this anomaly of cow slaughter being illegal in certain states. And there are arguments in support of it because there are many groups and activists that believe banning any form of slaughter, even if it's for one species, is beneficial. But I am of the personal opinion that this is not the ideal solution, because India continues to try and increase its milk and leather exports. And unfortunately, that means these animals are still, there is something that has to be done with these animals. Either they're abandoned, or they're tortured, or they're killed very illegally and very painfully, because there are certain restrictions on when you can kill them. And many of them have to be a certain level of unfit and unhealthy. So the animals are pushed to that point so that they can be slaughtered. And while theoretically there are protections for these animals that come out of the dairy industry that should not be slaughtered, the government has set up very, very few centers, but a majority of the centers that should exist have not come into existence yet. So the animals that are produced as a result of dairy in India are often slaughtered in very brutal ways because there's no legal way to do it in these states. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is, how does your country tackle anti-cruelty laws? And are farmed animals included? Also, are there potential nuances depending on the purpose they are raised for example, food or fiber? Fabi, you're first up.
So as mentioned before, the animal rights movement is decades behind other countries. For example, our federal Congress doesn't have the faculty to regulate animal welfare. The way that we approach the topic is with animal health. So it's an intertwined concept, and this is a huge obstacle to tackle because we don't see the difference between animal welfare and what is having in actual good health the animal. So the only protections that we actually find are in the penal codes. I want to make the distinguish that we have a federal penal code and local penal codes. In those local penal codes, we find in some states the protection of farm animals for human consumption, but we don't even have divided the concept between a domestic animal and a farm animal. So we have to first stop there, because as you know, in criminal law, that the description of the crime should apply to the actual case. And we find that we are not clear if that protects the animal. And in mostly 90% of the penal codes, animals for human consumption are excluded of any protection from anti-cruelty.
Thank you. Paula.
So in Brazil, the situation is actually again, very similar, maybe similar to India now. Formally, the laws anti-cruelty laws exist, and if you take a first look at them, it can look like they are applicable to farmed animals. Our federal constitution is dated of 1988, so just 3 years after the Brazilian dictatorship ended. So why is this important? Because the federal constitution was this moment of hope for social rights, and it's very surprising and amazing that we do have an article in our federal constitution that recognizes the rights of animals not to be subjected to cruelty. And so it is there. It's in our constitution, and it opens a field for the farmed animal protection movement. And again, this was not expected in this time of our history. And I'm very thankful for the animal rights activists that were involved in the inclusion of this article in our constitution, because the discussion about animal rights would be far behind if this was not a constitutional right. But there are some other statutes that are from the 60s and the 70s, the Fauna Protection Act, the National Environmental Policy Act. These acts, they also mentioned animal rights, but they do not allow us to clearly extend the reach of these acts to animals raised for food. But the National Environmental Policy Act brings a very important aspect of environmental law, that is the strict civil liability. So anyone who commits an environmental crime, and in my personal understanding, crimes against farmed animals can be considered environmental crimes. Any companies that commit those crimes, they would be liable, even if they didn't mean to cause that harm. There is also the Environmental Crimes Act, and the Environmental Crimes Act is more recent compared to these other. And the Environmental Crimes Act is more effective in protecting animals raised for food. But the law has a broader environmental focus, and it's not specific to farmed animals. So it is very hard to apply the Environmental Crimes Act to animals raised for food, because the standards of the industry and of the law itself are very low. So the situations in which we could apply, in practice, of course, not in theory, in which we could apply the Environmental Crimes Act would be in very precarious ways of slaughtering. And so the big companies are not actually impacted by this legislation, because big companies usually do follow certain standards. Again, standards that are low, and they're not efficient, and they do not protect animals from being subject to cruelty. And this law is also very important because it extends the criminal responsibility, not only to individuals, but to companies. This is a very specific thing, and I'm not really sure how it is in other countries, but criminal responsibility is usually falls upon individuals and not companies. But in very specific cases, such as environmental crimes, companies can be held responsible. And when we're talking about farmed animals, this is very, very important because usually workers, farm workers, they are just following instructions or they are not properly trained. So if the criminal responsibility falls upon them, no structural change can be made. And the last thing is some states have animal welfare laws as well, but they either exclude farmed animals or they are insufficient to protect animals raised for fooding according to industry standards.
Thank you. Sonia.
That was really interesting to learn about. Just to add on to something that Paula said before I explain the general cruelty laws in India, India has something very similar when it comes to the investigations in particular, or any crime that is that companies can be held liable and they pierce the corporate veil. So usually if a fine is applicable, a fine is used, but in certain cases, they can pierce the corporate veil and every person in the chain of command all the way up will be held liable for these crimes and can go to prison for these crimes. So it becomes exceptionally important that if anyone who's listening or would like to carry out an undercover investigation in India, to please be aware that everybody involved becomes liable in certain cases. So if you wish to do so, please try and follow the law as best as you can. When it comes to the prevention of cruelty to animals, before I start this, I want to tell everyone a really fun fact about India. India is the first country in the entire world to have any sort of, the first written animal welfare tenet. It was actually in 800 BC by one of the kings. It was written on stone tablets, and it was the King Ashoka. He was the first person to mention animal welfare in the world in a written form, which I think is pretty cool. And we can see this ideology that India has had from Mahatma Gandhi to some of the religions that we hold in India, like Jainism, and even to a certain extent Hinduism, which believe animals have souls, the principle of ahimsa, all of these different ideologies that were part of Indian culture and history have translated into our constitution to a certain extent. So they find place in what are the directive principles and the fundamental duties of our constitution. And these aspects are not justiciable, so no one can be held responsible for them, but they're a very good way to encourage governments and the judiciary to look at things from an ecocentric perspective instead of an anthropocentric perspective. In the 1960s, the Prevention of Cruelty to Animal Act, as we know it, was formed. The Act has a lot of the rules that we've mentioned earlier, like the slaughterhouse rules. They all come under this Act and they're framed by a body called the Animal Welfare Board of India. And that body has this authority through the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. The Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act applies to all animals, farmed, wild, in every perspective. It details acts like physical violence, deprivation of food, water, basic health care as all crimes against animals. And it does prescribe prison sentences, albeit very small ones and in very rare circumstances. Are they actually used, those criminal repercussions? Usually fines are preferred. The Act has one section. Section 11 of the Act is the longest section, and it details all these acts that are considered to be cruel that should not be allowed, and they apply to all animals. But there is one part of this Act that says that nothing applies to the dehorning of cattle, the castration or branding or nose roping of any animal in the prescribed manner. And unfortunately, I have spent a lot of months trying to locate where this prescribed manner of castration, branding, and nose roping is, but I haven't found it yet, which means even if it does exist, and I'm not sure it does, it is exceptionally difficult to access. So I'm pretty sure no one's really following it. The second thing is it also restricts the application of this act to any animal that is used for food specifically for mankind, unless such a destruction or preparation was accompanied by unnecessary pain and suffering. And we can infer what this unnecessary pain and suffering would be from what we talked about in the slaughterhouse rules, where we talk about the fact that animals have to be stunned beforehand, they can't be slaughtered in front of one another, they have to be maintained in a way that they're healthy and not in any suffering. Unfortunately, in India, while we have extensively regulated the transport of animals, the trade of animals, even what happens to animals when there are cases of cruelty reported, where they will be placed, under whose custody, all of that is extensively regulated. There is no regulation on how to maintain an animal up until the point of slaughter, or up until the point of transportation of slaughter, or up until the point of sale. So a majority of the animal's life is unregulated, particularly for farmed animals. Companion animals have separate laws that do regulate how they're supposed to be maintained, but for farmed animals, there is very little, and the only thing that really applies is the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. Unfortunately, the fines under the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act are valued at about less than $1 to $1.50 if I were to convert it into US dollars. So there is good as not useful. And since prison sentences are rarely enforced, that's not very useful as well. The main thing that has changed is in 2017, they came up with the case property rules, which essentially confiscates the animal off bat. So what a lot of people who would commit cruelty acts would say in court was, yes, I committed the act, fine me the dollar, and I will move on with my life and my animals. Now what has happened is that the second a cruelty case is made, the animals are supposed to be confiscated and taken to a shelter, given medical treatment, and maintained until the end of the suit. If the owner is responsible for paying for the entire treatment and maintenance and transport until the suit is completed. If they fail to do so, they have to voluntarily give up the animals. And often these are a large number of animals. So the major financial burden and the major impact is the actual cost of the animals or the maintenance of the animals that becomes the punishment, which is a very interesting way of how the law has developed to kind of still protect animals without actually changing the base law. There's a huge campaign in India called the No More 50, which is trying to change and increase the penalties for animal cruelty. That's most of it. And there's just one tiny last part, which is under the Indian Penal Code, which is our primary criminal legislation. There are two sections, 428 and 429, which talk about the killing, poisoning, maiming, or rendering useless of any animal whose worth is above 60 or 70% of what is worth of $1. So most animals come under this classification. And it's a very effective tool to get the police to recognize the crime and carry out acts that confiscate the animal. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia, especially for that fun fact. I did not know that. And that's a great segue into our next question, something that you brought up. Does your country have any laws or regulations that regulate farmed animals during transportation? So we'll start with you, Fabi.
Well, as mentioned before, we have an official Mexican standard that is a federal regulation. Unfortunately, it's from 1995. And even though it's supposed to be updated every 5 years, for example, last year was the year that should be updated, the Ministry of Agriculture decided that they didn't have the resources to discuss and update the regulation. So there are really minimum welfare standards for the animals, mainly that they don't die during the transportation time. Also, we are starting live export to other countries, mainly maritime transportation, and that of course is not included in that regulation. We believe that one of the parts that they want to grow is actually live export, and we are hoping that we can pressure the Ministry of Agriculture to actually establish minimum standards for the animals. Thank you.
Thank you. Paula.
We do have a regulation regarding transportation of animals, but it is, even though it is recent, it is from 2019, it does not determine maximum travel time for each species. It does not determine maximum speed allowed for each vehicle. It mentions climatic conditions of the vehicles, but only that the amount of animals in the vehicle must be adjusted, which is obviously not enough to determine if the conditions of the vehicle are adequate. And we do know that thermal stress is the major cause of death in transportation. So not addressing this specific issue is a very important aspect and shows how limited this regulation is. The space conditions that are established in this ruling are, again, very low standards, and they could be a lot better. And when we're talking about transporting cattle, sheep, horses, and pigs, the floor of these vehicles, they should be made with wood shavings and bedding material for resting, for these animals to be able to rest. And this is something that is not in the regulation, and probably wouldn't even be something possible for us to ask the government agencies to establish, because it makes the transportation process a lot more expensive. And it's also important to understand that depending on the material that is used in these vehicles, the risk of contamination during transportation is also very high. So you can see my cats in the back. You've seen them in the middle of the presentation. They are part of everything that I do. As I said previously, I'm in their office. So excuse me for their interference. This regulation was open for public consultation. I don't know if there are similar procedures in your regions, but here in Brazil, it is possible for public agencies to allow the public to make suggestions in these rulings. But what we've seen, especially in the most recent years, is that society doesn't really participate. These public consultations are just open to for the public agencies to say that this opportunity was given, but we sent pertinent comments in the past and nothing was accepted. So this is the regulation we have nowadays for terrestrial transportation. I forgot to mention that everything that I said was related to transportation on road. But live export is definitely one of the major issues in Brazil. Brazil is the main exporter of cattle in the world. Most of hundreds and thousands of animals are exported each year. And there is a pending bill that is to be voted by the Senate And apparently it will not go anywhere. Like the Senate doesn't have a deadline to vote this. So there are some pending cases on litigation to stop animal live export in Brazil, and definitely then the amount of suffering and how intense the suffering of these animals, then how intense the suffering of these animals happen in live export. It is the worst that I've seen. So I would say that in terms of transportation, live export is a key issue to be discussed.
Thank you. Sonia.
So we do have very specific laws on transportation. There are three main rules that govern this. One is the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Brought in Pack rules, which details how animals used for transportation of goods like bulls and cows and horses and donkeys are treated. And while they're not farmed animals used for consumption, they are used in farming. So I thought it would be relevant. The second one is the transport of animals on foot rules. As Paula mentioned, temperature is kind of important in these situations. And there are a lot of restrictions on the number of hours they can work, the temperature, what the temperature range has to be when they're being made to walk on foot. The distance they can go, the incline at which they can go, all of these are restrictions that are both in the Jordan pack animal rules when it comes to if they're using wheelbarrows and stuff, wheeled carts, or if they're walking themselves and how that works. And then there's also the transport of animal rules, which deals with the specific requirement of transportation of a large plethora of animals and very specific requirements. So each species has a specific section, and some of the species mentioned are cattle, sheep, goats, poultry, and pigs. And these are very, very specific requirements. They're made both for individually for road, there's a separate list, individually for the rails, and individually for the air. And we are lucky that in our country, there are requirements for the extent of bedding that's required, how the animals have to be stored. The animals have to be kept the amount of space required for them, how they're even supposed to be loaded into the cart, the ramp that is required, the material of the bedding, how they have to be transported in their social groups, which is something that makes me very happy. The age at which they can be transported, the condition in which they can be transported, they're supposed to have a veterinary certificate. So these rules are exceptionally extensive. And again, because these are rules that kind of follow through from the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, the punishments aren't that much, but thanks to the case property rules, often the only time activists can get to these animals between where they've been housed and the slaughterhouse, where they're going to be brutally slaughtered in contravention of the law, is to catch them in violation of these transport rules. So they often work with the police and other government authorities and set up checks on the highway. And because the laws specifically state that a police officer can make you take the truck with the animals and get them tested to make sure that they are healthy and uninjured and free from torture and pain, that significantly helps in this process. So the transport of animal rules are exceptionally detailed, and they are very useful because they're a very good way for activists to reach these animals without trespassing and without carrying out other acts that may violate the criminal law in existence. So that's something that is very effective. And as already mentioned, the Food Safety and Standards Authority have specific guidelines on how animals meant for slaughter should be transported. And just one more thing. There's something that I thought was great about India's Supreme Court. The Supreme Court of India has not just held the owners of these animals liable and the drivers who are driving these trucks, but they've also held the owners of the trucks liable for animal cruelty and punish them. And that's a very, very good incentive that the Supreme Court has given for truck owners to not allow illegal transport. And it kind of adds another layer of a check to the transportation of animals.
Thank you. Great points. Okay, so our last question, we've come up with a topic for each speaker. So each speaker now has the opportunity to talk about something of interest related to farmed animals in their country. So they've selected something that's of interest for themselves. So Fabi, you are first up.
I mentioned it before, but I would like to go into deep about how intertwined is organized crime with our daily activities. Everybody knows that it's a huge problem here in Mexico, the cartels, but they don't understand the implications. For example, if you believe that you are exempt of helping monetize the cartels, let me debunk that part. So every time you buy an avocado from Mexico, you're contributing. Let me tell you the story about it. So the cartel went to the union of avocado farmers and said, we want an informal tax. And the answer from the union was no. So they kidnapped the children of the leaders of that union and killed them. And after that, of course, they accepted that kind of informal tax. So you are contributing in that way. And it also permeates because we have around 52.4 million people in poverty and 9.23 million people in extreme poverty. That means that it's really easy for the cartels to bring people to their activity. And also it means when they start having their own money, they buy animals and they buy farms and ranches, so they family have a honest way of living. It repercutes because sometimes that becomes big companies, as we have seen, and it grows from generation, but they still have the protection from the cartels. Also, we have this problem because of when we go to the part of law enforcement, even they are part of the problem or they don't have the resources to fight it. So I want to bring awareness to this topic because, of course, you know that being an activist here in Mexico or a reporter is a huge risk, but at the same time, we have so many restrictions of our possible activity because, of course, our security is first. And again, I want to bring awareness of the products that you buy that maybe you can contribute to organized crime. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabi. Paula.
It's hard to speak after that. Thank you so much, Fabi, for warning us and about this issue. And it's such an important intersectional issue. And I think the topic I wanted to talk about is also aligned with that, and how the animal protection movement has to be intersectional and has to understand the context of other species, so other social problems, and it's not putting the interests of people above the interests of animals, but understanding that those interests, they have to go together. We have to fight against oppression, all kinds of oppression. So, but I wanted to talk a little bit about today is anti-carceral veganism and how the anti-carceral approach faces obstacles, and it is hard to talk about that in Brazil. Right now, we are celebrating the increase of penalty for mistreatment of dogs and cats. This has been a long time fight for the animal protection movement in Brazil. And of course, there are different ways to look at this. And I'm not saying we should not celebrate. the animal protection movement has such few wins that when we do have something to celebrate, I think we should. But I think we should also be aware of the possible consequences of that and how criminalizing individuals can be tricky when it comes, especially when it comes to protection of farmed animals. And there is one aspect of this new law that I want to highlight because I think it is very important. There are so many studies, not only in Brazil, but in the States, in Mexico, and in India. I came across some studies there as well that relate the violence against domestic animals, the violence against companion animals, and gender violence, and what we call here domestic violence. So we do have protection legislation that protects women and protects women from domestic violence, and the increase of penalty for the mistreatment of dogs and cats is a way to protect women from violence and indirectly. So there is, of course, this aspect of it. I don't want to be insensitive to this. So when we mention anti-carceral approach, this might sound like we are saying that no prison and it means no responsibility. So that's definitely not what I wanted to discuss here. So there are positive aspects that can be considered when we talk about increase of penalties. But if we take this, right now we are only talking about this related to dogs and cats, but if we apply this to farmed animals, that could mean that we would be incarcerating BIPOC communities, where we would be incarcerating Black workers, Indigenous workers, in poverty communities. So we know which people in which, we know who's working in farms and slaughterhouses. And if we take the carceral approach and apply this to the criminal responsibility of the workers, then we are just going to be increasing a social problem. And there are so many studies that show that carceral approach don't really bring good results. So Brazil has one of the largest incarcerated populations in the world. We are behind the United States, not just by a few thousands of people. So we do have this culture of incarceration that is something that we desperately need to talk about. And it's not like our social situation is that much better because we are incarcerating people. So there's nothing that tells us that incarcerating people will lead to better results for animals. So I think we should at least start this discussion while we still have time. And we still have time in Brazil to change that reality and to think about alternative ways to address animal cruelty. And again, I'm not saying we shouldn't hold people responsible. Of course we should, but who are we holding responsible? Workers or companies? The government of our impoverished communities? That's the discussion I think we desperately need to start having in this region.
Thank you both for highlighting these important issues and for starting discussions about topics that are difficult to talk about. Sonia.
Thank you, Fabiola and Paula. Sorry, I'm used to calling Fabi. Thank you both so much. I learned a lot. And I really appreciate you sharing that with us because I know they're not easy topics to cover. My topic's a little bit on the lighter side. And it's slightly more positive, and it's something that's unique to India. In India, the citizens have a lot of power, as does the judiciary, to work for animal protection. And this comes from the constitutional principles that we have and the way our judiciary works. So public interest litigations are a legal anomaly in India. they allow any citizen, or actually any citizen in India, to approach the Supreme Court or the high courts in various states directly to ask for a redressal of a public issue in which they have no vested interest. So these are often used for environmental protection, for the rights of women. We've seen rules come about to prevent sexual harassment at the workplace. And often a lot of these changes are brought forth because there are lacunae in the law. And there are a plethora of cases that we can look at through the history of our Indian judiciary where they have made significant impact by utilizing this. And one of the ways they do this is through a very special clause in our constitution, Article 142. Article 142 gives the Supreme Court of India the power to do complete justice, whatever that may be, and beyond what the law may say. Now, there are restrictions on this, and there's a lot of jurisprudence around this that says that it should be restricted to those areas where there is lacunae, or those areas that are not regulated and we need regulation, as we did at one point for the sexual harassment issue at the workplace. But the courts have really utilized this and have strived to do complete justice in many of these cases. One of the biggest animal welfare cases in the country was AWBI versus Nagaraja. And that was a case that ended the use of bulls for entertainment. So we had something that could be compared to the bullfighting. It's a very, very brutal activity. It involves a lot of humans trying to tackle bulls whose tails have been broken. Spices have been added to their eye. They're made to get drunk. It's awful. And they try to regulate it to reduce the cruelty, but that hasn't really worked well. So that was like one of the first major cases that changed things. There are 2 high courts that have granted legal personhood to all animals in those states and granted citizens guardianship and the responsibility to ensure that these animals are protected. And this applies to animals overall, but it is also possible for individuals because of the constitutional principles that make it a fundamental duty to show compassion towards animals, for individual citizens to report cases. So if an individual citizen saw a violation in contravention of the slaughterhouse rules or the food safety standards, simply on the grounds of animal welfare, they would be well within their rights to report this to the police. And because of another Supreme Court judgment, the police are mandatorily required to file an first information report, regardless of whether they want to or not anymore. So because of this unique bond between the judiciary and the activism of individual citizens, not just organizations, there has been substantial changes in the animal welfare movement, and a large part of them have come through the judiciary. One of the things that has been done by the National Green Tribunal is to apply environmental laws to farms where more than 5,000 poultry birds are there for eggs. Earlier, the number was much, much higher. Before the environmental laws would apply. They've also banned banned the entry of certain species of animals to certain states in India because they know they will be slaughtered there and they cannot see any other purpose for transporting this animal. So this is something that I think is really positive about India, and something that I wanted to share because there's so much opportunity for volunteers, individuals, and people who care and want to do something to participate in not just enforcing the law, but also creating law where the law does not exist. And it's not creation, it's extension, technically, but to extend the law where it doesn't exist, to help all of these animals and change the way animal welfare and rights works in our country. So that was a bit of a happy point, but it's something that I'm very, very glad about in my country, and why I'm very glad to work here and be able to contribute to this as an individual.
Thank you for ending us on a high. And thank you to all of our panelists for contributing. and participating in this panel. This was a great panel, and I am happy to have moderated it. And so now we're going to get into the Q&A portion of our panel. As I noted before, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you have any questions, please type them in there and I will read them out to our panelists. We currently have a question for the panelists. Do you feel that the reduction, if not the elimination of animal cruelty is making progress in your countries? Are you hopeful? Also, can you say whether the public seems to support this effort or do they not generally care? And we can maybe just keep the order. If everybody might have an answer to this, we can keep the order. I'll start with you, Fabi.
Of course, I'm hopeful because that is the reason why I wake up every day and work at MFA. I think we are at the baby steps. We have to bring a lot of awareness to the people because as Mexicans, we have the conception that the animals are grown in happy farms where they have big spaces to roam and they are really happy. And we have to bring awareness that those are not the conditions. And it's more common than not the intense confinement of animals. We are doing baby steps. We're contributing to eliminate the animal cruelty. We are for a long haul, but we are hoping to, in a couple of years, eradicate it at all and bring everybody to a plant-based diet.
Thank you. Paula.
I have to say something very similar to what Fabi said. Of course, I'm hopeful as well. And I think not only that's the reason I wake up every morning, but also I feel like we need to live up to the legacy of people like Rena Roseman. And these people fought, and we need to do them justice, to keep doing the work that they've started. So this is not just about ourselves, and this is not just about what my personal beliefs are. This is about carrying on this fight that I honestly believe that we are going to be alive to see plant-based diets be the rule. And I'm hopeful that I will be alive to see the end of factory farming. And I don't think that this is something that is so far in the line, you know. I think this is something that I can almost touch it, you know. I can feel it in the tip of my fingers. But if you ask me if I see the reduction or elimination of animal cruelty right now, no, I think we are still going down the hill. Things still have to get a bit worse, and people still need to be more aware, as Fabi said, for us to, at least in Brazil, for us to actually see some actual improvement. But one thing that fills my heart with hope is the amount of people that are considering themselves vegans and vegetarians. This number only increases, and that is not directly related to the reduction of animal suffering, but it is an indication that people are becoming more and more aware. So for the number of vegans or vegetarians to turning to actual reduction of animal suffering, I think we still have some work to be done there, a lot of work to be done there, because there is also increase of egg consumption and even meat consumption in some areas. But without public support and public awareness, and it's impossible to make any progress. Like, we need to change laws, we need companies to commit, and we need support from the public. And at least from this part of our fight, I think we're doing a really, really good job. People are becoming more and more aware, and people who are going to see this presentation, people who are watching this presentation now, like, you're the proof. Like, if you need any evidence, you just have to look at yourself in the mirror every day. Like, you're the proof that we're making progress.
Thank you. And thank you for that call out. I am always trying to make arena difference. So Sonia.
Personally, and this is my personal belief, and I think there are different ways to approach animal welfare and the eradication of cruelty and suffering. But I believe that animal welfare and animal rights have to work in tandem, because we cannot wait and allow them to suffer until we get those rights and they stop being needed. And perhaps that change will come through science, through the introduction of plant-based and cell-based meats. Our government has looked into and seen very encouraging of research into these areas, which I think is a massively positive move. There have been a lot of changes that have happened in the last few years, in the last few decades, that have significantly impacted animal welfare and animal protection. Unfortunately, the public in my country does not care. I'd like to say they care, but we happen to do research on it and they don't care, particularly the younger generations. And there are a few reasons for that. One is that, as Fabi mentioned, there are a lot of people who simply think their animals come from the farms. They share the same ideology that many international viewers of India share, which is that India does not have much intensive confinement, when in reality, a majority of their produce is intensive confinement. And because there are no regulations on using the term like any of the welfare terms, people just assume that farm fresh means from a green, happy farm. So one is they lack the understanding of the problem. Two is India, much like Fabiola and Paula's countries, there is a significant amount of our population that is in poverty, that is suffering, and is something that we see and interact with on a daily basis. I'm not sure of the extent to which people have to interact with this in your countries, but at least in mine, there are a lot of people suffering constantly. And for reasons that I'm not fully sure I understand, we have started to see animal welfare as an either or situation. We either care about human rights or we care about animal welfare. And these factors have really impacted it. One of the main things that the courts also look into when we report these cases is how we can offset the harms that are going to happen to the people that are extremely dependent on this and do not have other sources. So the workers on the farm more than the owners of the farm. And they're more likely to give you a favorable animal judgment if you can show them that you have a plan or an idea to offset some of that harm and that economic loss to some of the poorest sections of our people. So it's unfortunate that it's seen as two separate things when in reality it's connected. There's bonded labor, there's child labor, all of that in the farm animal industry. And and I hope that soon people will start seeing animal welfare and human welfare as something that is connected and something that has to develop together. But I'm extremely hopeful because there is more animal law being spread in my country. More people are looking to engage in animal welfare work. There are more volunteers. There are amazing judgments coming out for animal welfare. So I'm pretty hopeful that we'll be able to change the system. But I think it might take some time for everybody to get on board.
Awesome, thank you. Do we have any more questions? If not, I have a question for you guys. How prevalent is government subsidization of animal agriculture in your respective countries? Are certain sectors of animal agriculture more heavily subsidized than others? Are advocates working to change this? Fabi, I'll start with you.
Well, we had a very subsidized animal agriculture, but when our new president came into office, he decided on a policy where we will cut any expense meaning every expense. So we see how every year they cut and cut and cut the subsidies for the industry and for everything, including human health. And we have tried in the past about advocating to eliminate it, but fortunately the government is doing that job for us. Yes, there are certain sectors that have more benefits, like for example, the poultry industry doesn't receive any kind of subsidize. The other industry does. Is the only main division between animal agriculture.
I just jumped in. So yes, meat industry in general is heavily subsidized in Brazil. There's even this common saying among animal activists that if meat costed its actual cost, people wouldn't be able to afford it. And not only these companies receive tax benefits, but also they are they don't pay, when they don't pay taxes, they get away with it. So there are some studies which I can happily share with you. There are some studies showing that meat companies are actually the ones that pay less taxes, and they owe a lot to the government. And we have this idea that they are good taxpayers because they are a big industry, but it's actually quite the opposite. And so they not only receive benefits, but they also receive these bargains. So it is a heavily subsidized industry. I would say, I'm not really sure which sector of the industry is more subsidized, but I can say that the worst taxpayers are the cattle meat industry, in the cattle meat industry, which is not exactly what you're asking. I see that, but it is a way to show you that probably the cattle raising industry is the number one in terms of receiving directly or indirectly public funding.
Thank you. Sonia.
So we're heavily subsidized, funded, and promoted. I think if I'm right, I think over 15,000, maybe 15,000 crores, like massive amounts of money. I can't do the calculation for that because crores have to be converted to billions, and then I have to divide that by 70, 75 to get the right value in dollars. But it's safe to say it's pretty massive. And the government every few years tries to double or by 50% increase the leather production, the milk production, the egg production. They also try to provide free dairy and basically free animal protein for their midday meals. And so basically they're not only encouraging consumption, they're also encouraging all of it. They're promoting these things, they're advertising them, they're giving them funding to establish themselves, they're giving them loans, and they continue to promote it. Particularly intensive confinement is what they continue to promote, which is rather problematic. The government spends a lot of money trying to promote. It's something that I wasn't expecting, and every time I think about it, I'm kind of blown away by the massive quantity that goes into this. The government also unfortunately has insurance schemes that require particularly brutal forms of actions like debeaking and declawing before you're even eligible to get insurance on your poultry. So that's also a problem. The government also fails to regulate a lot of stuff. Basically, any concession that they can give to these farmers, whether it's the ability to skip out on these rules when they feel like they have a disease outbreak and have mass graves for these animals where they're buried alive, or it's funding them directly or indirectly, the government does do it wherever possible. And one of the main reasons is because it's a massive earner for export. And another one is because there are a lot of malnutritioned people in India, and I assume they find it easier to transport this stuff than other things. Or they believe it's better for reasons I'm not sure. Those are the two main reasons I can think of as to why they would spend this much money, apart from the whole lobby that encourages it.
Thank you. And we are at time. So thank you to our wonderful panelists for putting on such a great presentation. Thank you to everyone for joining us. And thank you to the committees for hosting this great International Animal Law Speaker Series.
Thank you.
Thank you.